I was constantly trying to find a way to cope and overcome as much as possible. On the cusp of his 40th birthday, which should have marked stability and a new chapter in his life, the signs of escalation are mounting. As Prince Harry approaches his 40th birthday, the mood isn't one of celebration, but rather a question that feels like a political bombshell. Will the multi-million-pound inheritance from Princess Diana's inner circle actually be paid out, or will it be blocked at the last minute? What initially appears to be another chapter in a fractured sibling rivalry, on closer inspection reveals itself to be a power struggle over money, morality, and control, the repercussions of which extend far beyond private family matters. According to palace sources, Prince William is considered the central figure behind a move that could financially cripple Prince Harry. The heir to the throne is said to be determined to freeze his brother's access to substantial assets. At the heart of the matter is a trust established by Princess Diana, which until now has been considered sacrosanct. For years, it was assumed that these funds would be disbursed regardless of political or family tensions. But this certainty now appears to be crumbling. Observers report an unusual nervousness behind the scenes. Unlike public spats or media revelations, this involves a substantial sum of money that will either be paid out or not. Prince Harry was said to have firmly believed that this inheritance represented a kind of financial safety net, independent of his break with the royal family. But from Prince William's perspective, the question is no longer whether a brother will receive money, but rather what that money will ultimately be used for. According to insiders, Prince William views the situation as a moral turning point. The assets from Princess Diana's circle were never intended to further inflame long-standing conflicts or damage institutions to which she herself was connected throughout her life. This is precisely where the current dispute begins. The potential suspension of payments is not being portrayed as punishment, but as a protective measure, a narrative that elevates the conflict to a new level. The timing further intensifies the tension. A milestone birthday is traditionally considered a turning point, even within the British aristocracy. The fact that legal and financial measures are being taken now seems like a deliberate show of force. While Prince Harry lives in California and leads an expensive lifestyle, reports of mounting financial pressure are mounting. The prospect of an expected payout suddenly being jeopardized dramatically alters the situation. Intensive discussions are reportedly already underway behind closed doors. The focus is not only on Prince Harry himself, but also on the legacy of Princess Diana. Her name lends the dispute an emotional weight that politically charges every decision. No one in the palace circle wants to give the impression of exploiting her memory. And yet this seems inevitable. Critics are asking whether Prince William is going too far. Supporters, on the other hand, see a man taking responsibility and drawing clear lines. One thing is certain: the conflict is no longer a private matter. It touches upon fundamental questions of loyalty, duty, and the price of personal freedom. Should the inheritance actually be blocked, it would send a signal of historic significance, a sign that familial ties are being subordinated to the protection of the institution. Nothing is definitively decided yet, but the unease grows with each passing day of uncertainty. As the countdown to his birthday continues, one crucial question remains. Is Prince Harry facing a financial turning point that will permanently alter his life, or is the looming freeze on his funds merely the prelude to an even greater power struggle within the family? The deeper one looks behind the scenes, the clearer it becomes that the current conflict did not arise spontaneously. At the heart of the dispute is a document that received little attention for decades and has now suddenly become a key legal and moral issue. It is a handwritten addendum to Princess Diana's estate, considered within the family to be a binding guideline for the administrators of her assets. What was once formulated as a well-intentioned gesture is now evolving into a powerful instrument. According to consistent assessments from within the estate circle, Prince William is said to have brought precisely this document into play. The document stipulates not only that the funds should benefit his two sons, but also what purpose they should serve. The emphasis, therefore, lies less on an unconditional entitlement and more on the responsibility to preserve the family's reputation and the memory of Princess Diana. This interpretation changes the entire perspective on the inheritance. For years, The assets of Princess Diana's inner circle were considered sacrosanct. Prince Harry could assume that these funds would be disbursed regardless of his break with the royal family. But now it is argued that the circumstances have fundamentally changed. From Prince William's perspective, the original spirit of this provision is no longer preserved. The inheritance, according to this new interpretation, does not serve to stabilize the situation, but rather threatens to fuel ongoing conflicts. This is precisely where the escalation begins. Observers speak of a strategic shift away from emotional appeals and towards sober legal logic. Prince William is said to have emphasized to the trustees that the assets from this trust were not intended to finance public attacks or further exacerbate long-standing tensions. This argument adds a new dimension to the matter, as it brings the question of moral purpose to the forefront. Critics see this as a dangerous balancing act. They warn against retrospectively reinterpreting Princess Diana's wishes. Supporters, on the other hand, argue that this very wish is now being taken seriously for the first time. The dispute is thus developing into a fundamental conflict over the interpretation of legacies and the responsibility of subsequent generations. It is no longer just about money, but about the power to define the narrative. The role of Earl Spencer, Princess Diana's brother and the central administrator of her legacy, is particularly explosive. He is at the center of a silent power struggle being waged behind closed doors. On the one hand, he is considered the guardian of the family's promises. On the other hand, he can hardly escape the political weight of Prince William. Every decision carries the risk of being perceived as a partisan statement. The uncertainty is already affecting everyone involved. While Prince Harry awaits clarity in California, the pressure is mounting on those in charge in Great Britain. The prospect of a long-awaited inheritance not being paid out calls fundamental assumptions into question. At the same time, it reinforces the impression that financial security within the family circle remains conditional. During this phase, a certain impression solidifies. Princess Diana's estate is no longer merely an asset, but a political symbol. Its release or blocking sends a message that extends far beyond the specific sum. It determines whether loyalty or independence is valued more highly. This brings one question increasingly into focus. Will this document ultimately serve as a shield for a legacy or as the trigger for a final estrangement between the brothers? As the legal debate intensifies, the real power struggle is increasingly shifting to a place that has served as the family's refuge for generations. The Old Horb estate, the ancestral home of the Spencer family and the final resting place of Princess Diana, has become the silent center of a conflict that now extends far beyond familial tensions. Here loyalty, political clout, and personal promises intersect. And here, it will be decided whether Prince William can assert his will. At the heart of this situation is Earl Spencer. As Princess Diana's brother and as administrator of key assets, he holds a position that involuntarily places him between two opposing sides. On one side is Prince Harry, who has relied on the support of his mother's side of the family for years. On the other is Prince William, who, as the future king, is not asking for favors but rather stating his expectations. This dynamic lends the conflict a new seriousness. According to sources close to the estate, Prince William has intensified his contact with those in charge. This is less about emotional appeals than about sending clear signals. The message is unequivocally one of approval. The decision would be perceived as a political one. Whoever pays out the inheritance at this moment is consciously or unconsciously positioning themselves against the future direction of the monarchy. This implicit message significantly increases the pressure on Earl Spencer. The situation is particularly delicate because it touches upon old promises. After the death of Princess Diana, Earl Spencer publicly pledged to protect the interests of her sons. This commitment is now being severely tested. Because in this case, protection no longer means just support, but also the question of whom or what is to be protected from. From Prince William's perspective, this protective function now opposes the use of the assets themselves. Observers describe the situation as a classic dilemma with no clear solution. If Earl Spencer yields to the pressure and blocks the payout, he risks a permanent estrangement from Prince Harry. If he releases the money, this could be interpreted as an open disregard for the expectations of the future king. Both paths lead to irreversible consequences. Music. This is precisely where the explosive nature of the decision lies. Furthermore, trusts of this kind do not function as simple sources of money. The administrators have discretionary powers that can be exercised in exceptional circumstances. According to available information, this very discretion is now being intensively examined. The arguments are based on the protection of the assets, the preservation of the family's reputation, and long-term security for future generations. This legal construct lends Prince William's actions additional legitimacy. At the same time, the impression is growing that a political signal is being sent. Prince William is positioning himself as the guardian of a legacy that is non-negotiable. Princess Diana's estate is not understood as personal property, but as part of a larger historical responsibility. This perspective fundamentally shifts the interpretation of the conflict. It is no longer about who is entitled to something, but about who decides what must be preserved. For Prince Harry, this development represents a significant worsening of his situation. The supposed security on which he had built his life for years is proving fragile. The realization that even his mother's inheritance is influenced by institutional interests is permanently altering the power structure. A family conflict is becoming a structural problem. As the decision date draws nearer, it becomes increasingly clear that Old Thorpe is no longer just a place of remembrance. It has become the stage for a silent but consequential power struggle. The overarching question now is, will Earl Spencer live up to his role as family protector? Or will the political logic championed by Prince William prevail? Parallel to the developments in Great Britain, the real source of anxiety is shifting further and further across the Atlantic. What at first glance appears to be an internal inheritance dispute takes on an additional, almost incalculable dimension due to U.S. law. Those close to Prince William are increasingly concerned that a payout of the estate could have not only familial but also legal repercussions that are completely beyond the control of the royal family. All eyes are clearly on California. Prince Harry has lived there for years with Meghan Markle, embedded in a legal system known for its strict regulations on family and property law. The principle of so-called commingling of assets, in particular, is considered a critical point. As soon as money from a personal inheritance flows into joint accounts or is invested in joint property, it can legally lose its special status. This very scenario is said to have been considered the worst-case scenario in internal discussions. From Prince William's perspective, the question is not only how Prince Harry will use the money, but whether it will remain within the family's sphere of influence in the long term. The idea that assets from Princess Diana's circle could be litigated in an American courtroom is considered a nightmare in palace circles. This isn't about abstract sums of money, but about symbolically charged assets considered part of the family legacy. Added to this is the latent uncertainty surrounding the future of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's marriage. Officially, unity is being demonstrated, but in aristocratic circles, it is considered a duty to consider even unlikely scenarios. Should a legal dispute ever arise, assets previously considered protected could suddenly become bargaining chips. This possibility significantly increases the pressure to act. Against this backdrop, an alternative strategy gains importance. Instead of a direct payout, arrangements are being considered that would permanently restrict access to the capital. The idea behind this is simple yet drastic. The assets remain formally assigned to Prince Harry, but are bound by British law and removed from his direct control. This would minimize the risk of American courts interfering. Observers see this as a paradigm shift. The conflict is moving from a moral debate to a highly complex legal battle. Prince William is no longer acting as an emotional brother, but as a strategic player systematically mitigating potential risks. The language of emotions is being replaced by the language of contracts and clauses. For Prince Harry, this development means a further restriction of his freedom of action. The prospect of being formally favored but having no direct access in practice represents a profound setback. Financial independence, which was considered a central motivation for his fresh start, would thus be diminished. What was hoped to be a form of security could turn into a permanent dependency. At the same time, this strategy sends a clear message both domestically and internationally. It signals that the royal family is prepared to go to the limits of what is legally possible to keep Princess Diana's legacy under its control. Critics see this as a show of force, supporters as a necessary safeguard. In any case, it is clear that the conflict has long since taken on an international dimension. The longer the uncertainty persists, the more firmly the impression of a cold, calculated approach solidifies. The emotional aspect recedes into the background, while legal risks and strategic scenarios dominate. This further escalates the situation and raises a crucial question. Is the potential intervention in the inheritance a legitimate safeguard against uncontrollable consequences? Or is Prince William crossing a line here that will permanently damage family ties? With each passing day without a decision, a reality comes increasingly to the fore. Long overshadowed by public debate, the financial situation in Montecito has been a major concern. Behind the facade of a privileged lifestyle, evidence is mounting of considerable economic pressure that is making Prince Harry increasingly vulnerable. This very pressure explains why the potential blocking of the inheritance has not only a symbolic but also an existential impact. Observers point out that the fresh start in the U.S. was associated with high fixed costs from the outset. The residence in California, security measures, legal disputes, and an extensive network of advisors have created a cost structure that requires consistently high incomes. In this context, the inheritance from Princess Diana's circle was always considered a stable safety net. It was seen as something that would remain in place regardless of media success or failure. This very net now threatens to tear. Furthermore, the economic environment has changed noticeably. Revenue streams that were once considered long-term are increasingly under pressure. Collaborations in the entertainment sector are volatile, public attention fluctuates, and the market for personal brands is unpredictable. For Prince Harry, this means a growing dependence on projects whose success is not guaranteed. The prospect of an expected inheritance being blocked at the same time significantly exacerbates the situation. Internal sources report that this uncertainty is forcing a strategic reorientation. Without the financial cushion from Great Britain, the pressure to generate income increases rapidly. This, in turn, amplifies the risk of private matters being further commercialized. From Prince William's perspective, this is precisely the scenario he wants to prevent. Blocking the inheritance thus appears not only as a tool of power but also as an attempt to control escalation. At the same time, Prince Harry feels increasingly cornered. The perception of being systematically cut off from financial resources reinforces the narrative of permanent exclusion. While Prince William acts as the heir to a centuries-old institution, Prince Harry faces the challenge of securing his financial stability in a highly competitive environment. This asymmetry further intensifies the conflict. Observers see this as a vicious cycle. The greater the financial pressure, the stronger the urge to take a public stance. The louder the public dispute, the more determined the countermeasures from Great Britain. Princess Diana's inheritance thus becomes the linchpin of a self-perpetuating conflict. What was once intended as personal protection is evolving into a lever with far-reaching consequences. The psychological component should not be underestimated. The idea that financial security remains conditional undermines the sense of autonomy. For Prince Harry, who also saw his break with the royal family as a step towards independence, this is a serious setback. The looming blockade feels like a belated correction to this new beginning. The longer this situation persists, the clearer it becomes that it's not just about numbers. It's about control, the power to interpret events, and the question of who defines the terms. The financial reality in Montecito acts as a magnifying glass, revealing the consequences of every decision. Ultimately, a central question emerges. Will the growing economic pressure force Prince Harry to take further steps that deepen the conflict? Or does this phase mark the point at which a new, albeit painful, balance is established? At the end of this conflict, all the threads converge on a fundamental question that extends far beyond individual people. The dispute over Princess Diana's estate has long since become a symbol of loyalty, power, and the consequences of personal decisions. What began as a family conflict has evolved into a structural test of resilience, in which moral arguments and institutional interests are inextricably intertwined. At this stage, Prince William no longer appears merely as a brother, but as a representative of a system seeking to protect itself. His actions follow a clear logic. Wealth associated with a historical legacy must not circulate unchecked. From this perspective, the potential blocking of the inheritance is portrayed as an act of responsibility. It is about preserving a memory that should not become a tradable commodity. This stance lends his actions a moral legitimacy that transcends personal motives. At the same time, the flip side of this logic is revealed. Prince Harry faces the realization that independence means not only freedom, but also the loss of security. The expectation that certain resources will remain available regardless of loyalty or behavior proves to be illusory. The conflict reveals that financial privileges within the family are always tied to conditions, even if these remain unspoken for a long time. Observers see this as a silent lesson in power dynamics. Those who distance themselves from the center of an institution lose not only influence but also safeguards. In this light, the current escalation appears less as personal revenge and more as the consequence of a fundamental rupture. Prince William is drawing a line that makes it clear that distancing oneself comes at a price. Prince Harry, in turn, must face the reality that this price is higher than expected. Princess Diana's legacy is at the heart of a paradoxical development. On the one hand, it is invoked to justify protective measures. On the other hand, it itself becomes a point of contention, opening up new rifts. The question of how to interpret her will remains open and is answered differently depending on the perspective. It is precisely this ambiguity that makes the conflict so persistent and difficult to resolve. The public is presented with the image of two brothers who are not only fighting over money but also for the power to define the narrative. One defends the continuity of an institution, the other fights for personal autonomy. Both narratives possess their own internal logic, yet they stand irreconcilably side by side. A quick solution therefore seems unlikely. The closer a final decision draws, the clearer it becomes that there will be no winners in the classical sense. Every option leaves its mark, be it in the form of damaged relationships or long-term dependencies. The conflict thus marks a point at which personal freedom and institutional loyalty definitively diverge. In the end, the open question that will outlast this dispute remains. Is the protection of a legacy more important than the right to personal self-determination? Or does this conflict demonstrate that the two are never fully compatible in the context of great power? The escalating dispute over Princess Diana's estate reveals more than a family conflict. It exposes the tensions between personal freedom and institutional responsibility, between moral aspiration and political reality. Prince William positions himself as the guardian of a legacy that, in his view, must be protected from abuse. Prince Harry, on the other hand, is confronted with the realization that financial security does not exist independently of loyalty. The conflict unfolds on several levels: legal, moral, and symbolic. Documents from the past suddenly take on new significance, while current realities increase the pressure. The international dimension, particularly U.S. law, further complicates the situation and necessitates strategic considerations that extend beyond familial ties. For the public, the dispute becomes a reflection of fundamental questions. How far does personal autonomy extend when it is based on resources derived from an institutional context? When does protection become control? And when does freedom become a burden? The case demonstrates that decisions intended as liberation have long-term consequences, which may only become apparent over time. Regardless of the outcome, one thing remains clear: Princess Diana's legacy has become a touchstone, one that will determine the future of familial relationships as well as the self-image of an institution. This development compels all parties involved to take a stand, and the public to form its own opinion. Is the protection of the legacy accepted as a necessary consequence or perceived as an irreconcilable rift? The answer to this will shape the conflict for a long time to come.